This podcast is a part of the Local Government Podcast Network, where we give local governments a voice.
Welcome to the Building Amazing Cities and Towns podcast, the podcast for mayors, council members, managers, staff, and anyone who is interested in building an amazing city. Your host is Jim Hunt, the author of Bottom Line Green, How American Cities Are Saving the Planet and Money Too, and his latest book, The Amazing City, 7 Steps to Creating an Amazing City. Jim is also the former president of the National League of Cities, 27-year mayor, council member, and 2006 Municipal Leader of the Year by American City and County Magazine. Today, Jim speaks to thousands of local government officials each year in the U.S. and abroad. Jim also consults with businesses that are bringing technology and innovation to local government. Welcome, Jim. I'm excited to talk today.
Great, Matt. Thanks for being here.
So today we're going back into amazing, and we're working our way into I, which is inclusiveness. So if you would, explain what you mean by inclusiveness.
Yeah, and Matt, one of the things about cities and towns and across the world, inclusiveness is becoming more and more important in the daily lives of citizens and businesses all over the world. And, the news points that out, I think, almost every day, either positively or negatively. Unfortunately, the negative stories around inclusiveness, lack of inclusiveness probably dominates and is really in the listeners' minds probably more prominent. And that's really, when we talk about inclusiveness, we're talking about in race, in culture, in religion, in age, all of the various ways, sexual orientation, all the various ways in which we, in some cases, divide ourselves by some group or class or demographic, and building a community. And what's different about a community is that what normally comes to mind in cities and town, or in life about inclusiveness, people kind of I think they have probably a better idea about inclusiveness in their personal lives. Well, that means that you shouldn't hate people. You can talk to kids in school and they give you that definition of it. But surprisingly, in cities and towns, it brings in a very robust discussion in many communities. It brings in other issues that a person might be able to say, well, I go to my church on Sunday and there's people of different races and cultures in our church and we get along good. My kids go to school and there's different kids that grew up differently and all. And I think I'm a very inclusive person. But in a city or town, you're talking about, it can have impacts in communities. And over my career of working with cities all around the world and throughout the United States, inclusiveness sometimes is a heavy lift for communities. And I probably see the value maybe more than sometimes people said, well, as long as people are not fighting or as long as they're not on the headlines, we're doing a good job. And that's where I think in cities and towns, when I talk about inclusiveness, that's I'm digging deeper than that, because and I explain to people a lot of times is, listen, when it's on the front page of the paper in a negative light, it's pretty hard to dig out of that as a community, and it's good that you start to have those discussions and to get your community up to speed, if you will, before some tragic accident or some incident occurs.
Yeah, address it when it's more proactive. So why is it so important to get started looking at that?
Well, let me tell a story. And the one nice thing about our subject of dealing with cities and towns and local government is that why is it important? It's important because it's the future of your city or town. How you deal with the issues around inclusiveness will determine, in many cases, whether you grow in terms of population, whether you grow in terms of business community and all. And a lot of people find that a little bit hard to grasp. And do you get that push and pull in that, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when you talk about it, sometimes, and literally, I've gone to places and go to communities that have had a little bit of issues, a little community unrest, or just maybe a zoning issue in a community. And there'll be somebody who's either met me at the National League of Cities or have followed some of my work around inclusiveness, and they'll call me up and they'll say, Jim, would you come to our community and engage a community discussion on inclusiveness? And I've done that hundreds of times. But one of the things that happen is that there's a certain, in almost every town that I go to like that, there's a group that are saying, we don't want to put a spotlight on a negative in our community. Why are we inviting this guy to town? And that's a legitimate question, and I have to have an answer for that, and I'll give you the answer. I deal with businesses that are looking to locate. I deal with some of the thought leaders like Richard Florida, who's a person who talked about the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, of which I'm very familiar with. And in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University is in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh, Robert Morris College is in Pittsburgh. They have, educational-wise and technology and innovation, they are one of the leaders in the world. A person who graduates from Carnegie Mellon University will have they will be employed if they want to work.
Yes, absolutely.
They'll get a job. And the jobs that they're getting are the ones that are growing. Drone technology, driverless cars, innovation in technology and transportation and all. Those are the graduates coming out of the Carnegie Mellon system. And to prove it, Uber is testing the driverless cars in the city of Pittsburgh, probably the last city that someone would pick to do a driverless car because of the hills and the narrow streets and the crowded parking areas and so forth. But it's because of Carnegie Mellon and the work they've done. So, but Richard Florida, a noted author and a person who studies cities and the work around cities, noticed that for Pittsburgh, putting all of these graduates in technology out, that they were not seeing the benefits like Silicon Valley or around the hub in Boston and other areas, the Durham, Raleigh area, North Carolina, and Chapel Hill, where you have technology sectors growing out of, in these areas. And Pittsburgh, logically, Richard Florida thought that Pittsburgh, why are they not getting the benefit of that? And this has been about 10 years ago or more studies. So when he looked at it, he started to look at the culture in Pittsburgh. And the culture in Pittsburgh, of course, Pittsburgh was the steel city, the Pittsburgh Steelers. A lot of immigrants had immigrated in from Eastern Europe. They clustered in little groups and had churches and that, the Polish church, the Slovaks, the, Italian folks that immigrated in and worked in the steel mills. So you had these little cultural enclaves. And they found that, the neighborhoods were well identified. People would say, where's the Polish neighborhood? And it's all, you go over here. And where's the black district was the Hill District, the African-American area of Pittsburgh. And so it was so well defined, and that when someone showed up from India was at Carnegie Mellon University, and they went to a local market to look for the international food section, or they looked to get, just have someone understand who they are and where they're from. They were finding that it was not a welcoming community, that it was very insular, and the silos around these various, if you would, the old world, the old country, that was the way things worked back in the steel mills and so forth, that people came over and they clustered together and built their communities, and they could have put a wall around them because they were that impenetrable. So
yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned the grocery stores, supermarkets, that's not the first thing that jumps to your mind when you think of inclusiveness necessarily.
Right. And so from that standpoint, and I use that because I think, honestly, that's one of the best examples, and I'm so familiar with Pittsburgh. I'm there. I was there this week up at the National Speakers Association Pittsburgh chapter had an event, and I love Pittsburgh. And and here's the beauty of this. Pittsburgh and Mayor Bill Peduto and some of the people in Pittsburgh, I love what they've done. And Pittsburgh has become more inclusive. They have strategically become more inclusive. They are breaking down barriers. They are turning into this international city that is drawing people from all over the world. They're developing technologies and having people come into the city that previously probably would not have chosen Pittsburgh as a location. So inclusiveness can be the biggest boon to a city. It can also be like Ferguson, Missouri. I don't know, what their business attraction strategy is today, or their, resident attraction, or the quality of life in the community after the racial incident that happened in Ferguson. And they're on the headlines for being somewhat non-inclusive. So that's kind of the, from the gamut, is that inclusiveness is probably as important as any of the other factors we've talked about on building an amazing city. But the cities that are progressing quicker, and when I mentioned Pittsburgh, part of the Richard Florida study and his analysis of Pittsburgh was a pretty damning analysis of what was wrong with Pittsburgh.
Right.
So a city has to be open to accept their history and recognize that they would like to move forward in a more inclusive way. So that's, in a broad way, that's kind of why it's important, and a little depth about what it is.
Yeah, I like the explanation on the spectrum from Ferguson to the international section in the supermarket. That gives you a pretty good idea of what it's all entails. So how did you get so interested in this?
Well, and it started at home for me. It started in West Virginia. In my years back, I grew up in a time where segregation was just ending. When I was going into the public school system in West Virginia, two young ladies that were in the 7th grade with me were the two that, I sat in a classroom much like every 1950s era kid and thought that, life was good. I was white. I was, my last name was Hunt, and I just kind of was, gliding through life and seemed like I was the all-American story. And then it started to where I looked over to the next desk and I met a young African-American girl and became friends with her, and she's passed away since, but I was friends with her whole life, and we talked, and she was in the ministry, and really had just a when the realization hit me that I was going to school and I was a little worried in junior high about being bullied, she was worried about being killed. When she left,
puts that in perspective a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and when she came to school, there was no model for her to follow at that school. It was just being desegregated when I was in school. And I'm there, and the school was open. It was like 100-year-old school. So here I pop in, just a young white, I don't know what, 13-year-old kid. And I'm in this school and doing what kids have done for 100 years. She was blazing a trail in our community that had never been blazed before. When she walked into the doors of the school, she was likely to hear some of the, language and some of the hatred coming not only from the students, but sometimes even teachers who fully did not embrace the segregation or the desegregation at that time. So that's what got me started when I got into college. And at that point, there was a lot of unrest, or that was the Vietnam War era. And there was I went to a Black Studies course. That was one of my electives at West Virginia University. And surprisingly, the professor's name was Dr. Carl Hunt. And we joked that, that we were related. But so he started in, and I learned so much from him. And he gave me a background on kind of the civil rights movement that I didn't know. And I was seeing it through the news media, but I was not absorbing it as a college professor and a college course taught me. So I started gaining a little bit more appreciation and understanding going through the civil rights movement and all that was happening. And then getting into local government, it was interesting, is that in our community, in our city, had never had an African American on the city council, let alone many other, there was never a Hispanic on our council. There was never, I think one woman in the entire history of the city had served on the city council and never served as mayor on the council. So during my tenure on the city council, I felt that it was important that inclusiveness be a part of our city, that it bothered me that that was the lay of the land in my community. And I kept thinking where people would talk about it. And, it's like, well, does it happen by accident, or do you actually do things to promote inclusiveness? And guess what? The answer is you actually have to do things to promote it. It just doesn't come.
Yeah, absolutely. Like everything we've talked about so far in the amazing series is, it just takes that step in the right direction. Somebody to say, hey, let's look at this and see how we can make it better, because there's certainly benefits to it, and just the right thing to do.
Yeah, and when you dive into cities and you recognize that across the country, and some of it is just breaking loose now, that people would say, well, why isn't there more diversity on city councils across the country? Well, in many cases, they're designed that in many cities, that it's almost impossible for a minority to be elected to the city council, or if there's a 7-member board or a 12-member board and they divide the city into wards, the gerrymandering, much like on the national and state level, can happen in a city that you have, in essence, an African-American ward, you have maybe a Hispanic ward, but the majority rule in the cities would be predominantly white and predominantly white males. So, I started looking at that. Our city elected council members at large, and over the years, there would be occasionally an African American would run for city council, and they would be in 16th place or 12th place to elect for 3 city council members. And I recognized that it was probably never going to happen in my tenure, in my time on city council, that we were not probably going to break that record. But I thought, there must be a way of being more inclusive if you put your mind to it. And there was an event, a person passed away that was a sitting council member, and there was a vacancy. And I thought, there was a minister in town. He wasn't, I wasn't real close to him, but I knew him and I'd interacted with him at times. And I thought, geez, this would be great if that would be the way we could kind of break the color barrier in our community. So I went to him and asked him if he would be interested. And I told him, don't get your hopes up, because I have no clue, after 100 and some years, I don't have any clue that you're going to be considered on this, but I'm going to do my best. And so I went to a couple of my colleagues and talked to them and asked them. And of course, when you have a vacancy on council, if you want to be the most popular person in town, everyone wants to, they all love being on council. They just don't want to run for election, given all the divisiveness and all. So everyone, when there's a vacancy, people just flock to it and they call you and all. So I told him, I said, there's going to be a lot of competition for this, but I'm going to put your name forward if you want to. And he said he would. So I tried as hard as I could and debated and argued, and he did not get it. And but I did, out of that, got a commitment from one of the other council members that said, I've already promised my vote, and I'm sorry, and the guy's a great guy, and I'd vote for him on any other day, but somebody approached me. But he said if it ever happened again, he's right on my list. Well, 6 months later, one of our council members was elected to the county commission, and Pastor David Cates was selected as the first African-American council member in the history of the city of Clarksburg. And of course, fantastic. I mean, it was well received. He's passed away since then. He was one of my heroes and one of my best friends in life. He married me and my wife, and he performed the funeral service for my father. So just somebody who I don't have a better person in my life that I would think of than him. But at the end of his appointed term, he ran for the office and didn't get elected, and had the same challenges that people had in the past. So he was persistent, and he did a great job when he was appointed. So he continued to run. And it really got to the point, he'd run, I think, 2 or 3 times after being appointed and got beat. And it's pretty tough to lose an election. I've lost a few in my life. So
yes, absolutely.
So I understand what it's like. And so he'd lost twice, I think, in a row. And he came to me on the 3rd election. Now, this is every 2 years, so there's a lot of time passing. And other interest and other things that happen that sometimes you lose your interest in it. And especially if you've been rejected, you're like, I don't know if I'm going to do it. So he came to me one day and he said, Jim, he called me Mr. Hunt. He said, Mr. Hunt, I'm thinking of running again. And at that point, I loved him. And I said, Pastor, do you really think that you want to kind of walk through that brick wall again? And he said, I really do. And I said, well, I'll support you, but I'm just saying, let's think about this, because I just don't want you to be, to go through spending the money and doing all the stuff and the time and effort and then getting beat again. And so I wasn't like 100% like I was in the past. Well, he ran that time, and I was so proud of my community that he was elected as the first elected African-American on our city council. So in our council, we select the mayor from the city council on the first meeting of the new council. So he was eligible. He could be mayor if he got the votes. So I thought, boy, if we've done the historic thing of electing the first African-American council member in our city, wouldn't it be great if he could get the votes to be mayor? And my colleagues thought highly of him. It was contested, but he ended up getting selected on his first meeting as an elected council member. He was made the mayor. and did a tremendous job. I mean, just was a fantastic person. He did so much for our community. He was a leader from the day he was born. He was born in a foster home growing up in Columbus, Ohio. But so all that story, he came to. And the other part of that story was that right after becoming mayor, the Ku Klux Klan sent a letter to the city, to my city, and asked that they be given a permit to do a rally in town. And so obviously we kind of connected the two events together and
right.
thought, and the typical response when that happens, and it happens all over the country, you'll never know where it's going to happen and how it's going to be received. But the reception of a city that has just elected its first African-American mayor of getting this permit, in many cases, the goal of the Ku Klux Klan and some of these other hate groups is not necessarily to have a rally. They want to be in the news for the city rejecting it. And, how inclusive are they when they won't let us freely assemble on the courthouse square? So when they sent the letter, Pastor Cates was the mayor, and it was right about the second month he was in office, and everyone was focused. The media was focused because, he had this visible position then, and he was being interviewed, and they said, Mayor, what's your position on issuing this permit? He said, I have no problem whatsoever. He said, we're going to issue the permit. We're going to schedule it. We're going to make sure that everyone's protected. We're going to make sure that the Klan members that come to town are going to be protected and no ill harm comes to them. But he said, I only am requesting one thing, and that is that on that day when they're rallying at the courthouse, I would like to bring our community together and rally at our park for what's called the Unity Rally. And so the media was pretty surprised. There was a lot of stories. The Ku Klux Klan they had no intention of actually coming. So now they had to organize a rally and so forth. And so on that day, I can remember it like it was yesterday, the Ku Klux Klan was meeting. They had police protection. They had the bulletproof vest and the batons and all. And there was a handful of people in the community that were screaming and arguing and that. But there was just a handful. It was just maybe 6 Klansmen and 15 residents from the community. The police were there, and it was handled very well. But out at the park, when we did the Unity Rally, we had well over 100 residents. We had, it was a real chilly fall day, and we had the Secretary of State for West Virginia. We had politicians. We had community members. We had a band. We had a drum corps from a city about an hour away. And another interesting part of that, the Unity Rally, was that it was published in the Washington Post, and there was a judge from Austria who read it. He was visiting Washington, D.C., read it in the paper about this rally, and decided to take the 4.5 hour drive, rented a car, and had no intention of coming to our town. But he wanted to see this Unity Rally and how we were handling it. And it was one of the best events I'd ever been associated with in my life. And Pastor Cates just led the community through this kind of healing. And that started a process in our community where we started going, Pastor Cates and I, because he came to me and he said, Mr. Hunt, he said, in order for us to be inclusive, he said, I need a partner. And he said, I'd like to go out to the schools and that because I'm visible now, but he said, I need you there. So him and I started, we formed the formal part of the Unity Project, and we started on a school program. We traveled to schools all over the region and gave this program on unity. And out of that, we had a local high school that had a civil rights team, and the civil rights team all of a sudden, so they said, we want to help. We want to do, we want to be a model civil rights team. We want you all to be involved with us. So Liberty High School in Clarksburg, West Virginia became this model civil rights team. There was some of the students I'm still friends with, and it created that community spirit. So out of that, I was just getting involved with the National League of Cities, and they had a program through the National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials where they gave national awards for civil rights programming. And we submitted the Liberty Civil Rights Team, and they won a national award, and they were invited to Washington, D.C. to the National League of Cities Conference and recognized. And and a little bit back, like when we talked about our zing and about maximizing events. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could maximize? And I happen to know the first African-American mayor of Selma, Alabama, James Perkins. He'd just been elected. And so I called Mayor Perkins and I said, Mayor, I'm going to be bringing a group of young people to Washington, D.C. Do you think you could get the funding and be able to bring a group of young people from Selma, Alabama? And I'd like them to meet and at Washington and we'll have the professionals from the National League of Cities do some programming. And so that led to that. And we had an event in Washington, D.C. It was covered all over the country. And it was this group of African-American students from Selma and a group of predominantly, I think, all white students from West Virginia. And they sat in rooms and discussed race relations and civil rights and so forth. And that led to creating the National League of Cities Partnership for Inclusive Communities out of those events.
Okay, that's interesting. And what year was this that this all was going on?
This was in the late I think around 1990. Let's see, 1997, 98, something like that, right before the year 2000.
Okay. And that led to the National League of Cities Partnership?
Yeah, and what it was, so we did something in our town in West Virginia, in Clarksburg. One of the things and this is something we learned, and I think other cities have, I know other cities have taken it on, but this is a kind of a learning point in this message is that, if you have a community meeting on inclusiveness on a Tuesday night at the local YWCA or YMCA, the media might cover it. The meeting happens. The people that show up, there'll be 20 or 30 usually in most towns, even in big cities, there are 20 or 30 people shows up. But when that happens, it touches such a few people in the community that people really don't know that you're working on inclusiveness. So Pastor Cates and I came up with this idea. We said, we ought to put signs out. Well, of course, back then, it would cost money to advertise and to put billboards and things. So
sure.
So we came up, and this was something with cities. We said, well, we have a sign department in our public works department that does street signs and so forth. I wonder if they could make us up some signs. So we talked to the city manager and asked him. He said, well, yeah. He said, we do that all the time. We can make signs. And we said, would you make up a sign that says, welcome to our community. We are building an inclusive community. And they said, yeah, we'll do that. How big do you want them? Well, we had no idea. We said, 2 foot by 3 foot. And they said, okay, we'll do them. And said, how many do you want? And we said, how many can we get? And they said, well, reasonable. Let's start out. Let's get 5 or 6. And we said, well, let's get 6 of them. So we got 6 signs that we put at the entrance to every entrance to the city. And it said, welcome to our community. We are building an inclusive community. So, it started, people would talk about it, and they saw it every day going to work. And so and I would say this is in the branding and all of that. If you drive into a town that says welcome, we're we have the best pizza in the world, and it's on a city sign, so it's official. I mean, you'd be looking for pizza, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what the signage that we put out, people would come in, and our city was not by any means an inclusive community at that point, or we were working on it, but it said, welcome to our community. We're building an inclusive community. So then that, as the National League of Cities. So I had served on the board of the National League of Cities at that time, and we did this partnership with Mayor Perkins down in Selma. And at that time, I was kind of advancing in the leadership at the National League of Cities, so I was elected second vice president. And when you're elected second vice president, they ask you to pick a topic that you would like to have as your presidential topic, and then you have 2 years to develop it, and then you roll it out when you're president. So I said, I started thinking, I thought, well, man, we could really maximize our inclusive communities program. So I said, well, I'd like to focus on inclusive communities. And it worked out because the National League of Cities had a great history on topics. They did, Bob Knight was the mayor of Wichita, Kansas, who was my mentor on this. And Bob did a national, when he was president of the National League of Cities, he did the Undoing Racism campaign. And they spent 3 years studying racism and things and strategies to undo racism and so forth. And then Charlie Lyons from Lexington, Massachusetts, he was a selectman there. He served as president of the National League of Cities, and he moved it forward a little bit. And in addition to Undoing Racism, he carried on with another program dealing with kind of the beginnings of building an inclusive community. And then with my presidential topic of creating this partnership for inclusive communities, it just seamlessly went together. And it was, it led to, I think there was 200 and some cities that adopted the program. The National League of Cities had a complete set of worksheets and workbooks and strategies, identifying resources and so forth. And then during my presidential year, I was so pleased when we rolled out the program. It was on the front page of USA Today. I was on all the national medias, invited to attend international conferences, traveled all across the United States, many of the cities that would put up the sign. So as part of that, when I told the National League of Cities of this, they kind of winced a little bit because they said, Jim, we'll do all the research, we'll do all this stuff. So anything else? And I said, yeah, I'd like to have these great big signs. So that by then I knew how big a sign could be.
Right.
So when you really do a 2 foot by 3 foot sign, and when you're in a car, it doesn't look very big. It looks like just a tiny little no parking sign. So we had these great big 48-inch aluminum signs that said, welcome to our community. We're building an inclusive community. And then it was tagged with the National League of Cities Partnership for Inclusive Communities. And so they said, how are we going to ship these? And I said, listen, that's not my problem. I said, So as it turned out, there was hundreds of these signs. They're still out. They're in the news regularly. The signs are in Indianapolis and in Denver, Colorado, and Lakewood, Colorado, and places in Texas and California. So it just has been just a fantastic experience for me, is that I'll be driving in a cab or an Uber coming in to speak in a community, and I'll look up at the city limits and I see the sign that was there as part of my presidential topic with the Nation of Inclusive Communities.
The program lives on. So are there any steps that you can share that you discovered in your research and your experience putting it in place in your city?
Yeah, I think the one thing, there needs to be community leadership. I mean, it goes without saying, but a lot of times the reason, and it has to be from, I mean, and this is, I think, and this is my opinion, but it needs to have some connection with the actual city, with the organization, with the government part of the city. Because here's the challenge. In many cities, churches do an amazing job of working towards civil rights and being inclusive and welcoming and so forth. Some community organizations, the YWCA has had a national Undoing Racism campaign. So there's plenty of organizations that do it. But within cities, as we talked about Pittsburgh, there's a lot of places that develop silos in a city. So you actually have, segregated areas. The schools in Selma, Alabama today are more segregated than they were in the 50s. Just as a fact, white flight has taken place in a lot of cities, a lot of inner cities, and it's created wholly white suburbs and wholly non-inclusive areas and so forth. Now that's changing, but it's still evident in many places. So I think the steps that a community can take is that it needs to have leadership from the local community, whether that's from a council member, it could be from the mayor, it could be from the manager's office, it could be, the Office of Community Development or whatever, but it really says something when you have meetings in, let's say, a city-owned facility or a city auditorium, things like that. And then what that allows is to invite all of the various partners and the shareholders, stakeholders. So you bring in the churches, you bring in the civic organizations, you bring in community members and so forth. So the beauty of that is that in many cases, they don't talk to each other. They're doing great work, but they're not being, communicating between. And when the city takes a leadership role, it signifies, it just does, it's magic. I can't describe it differently than that, but it does something to the process that makes it a more viable process. Now that also points out the biggest obstacle is that challenges in some cities are that the cities don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
So here's my thought, my thinking is, and I've been called by cities that I go out, and I'll be called by an organization, a citizens organization that's sprung up to build a more inclusive such and such. And they tell me, they said, well, our mayor and council member won't participate. They just don't want, they don't want to bring undue negative attention to the city and so forth. And if there's been an event, they're gun shy and they're just wanting to stay out of the news. So because of my government experience and kind of walking the walk and doing it, I've been able to, in many cases, talk to the city, and whether they're a very visible member or whether maybe they're just going to allow the city council chambers to be used for it. Because what happens is, once again, somewhat magically, is when people start coming together and when they feel that they're all under the same umbrella, when they walk into a city hall or a city auditorium, that's whether the city's inclusive or not. When you're in the Selma Community Center, you're working in an inclusive community, a place that's building an inclusive community. And after a few meetings, and after, you might be there and the council is meeting, the mayor might be stopping by for some other business, and they look in the room and they start seeing these active community leaders and citizens working on inclusivity, and you hear what comes out of it. It's an amazing event, and I've been a part. I get invited, which is really kind of fun for me, is that I'm invited around the country to attend Unity Day celebrations. And I can remember one in particular down in Rock Hill, South Carolina. I was invited and given the key to the city, where they each year bring people together. They have a Unity dinner. They have, cultural foods, they have cultural dress, and they have, and it's just a fantastic event. But they also do other events throughout the year. So if you're a community, a city, a town that's looking to, if you think you're pretty inclusive and you want to get better, then there's some strategies. But I think a lot of it is having a city-focused orientation to it, making a true inclusiveness and true unity by bringing diverse parties together, and then taking small steps but leading toward a goal. So, a lot of communities say, well, let's do small steps, and then they just take small steps. You got to set goals. You have to set that, we're going to be a different community in 5 years. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're going to take the steps. We're going to bring in speakers. We're going to bring in people who look different than us. We're going to talk to business owners in our community. I can tell you, in a lot of communities, most of the healthcare are handled by foreign-born doctors. And all of these doctors, many are Muslim, many bring, a diverse cultural setting into a community. And in many cases, they've never had one phone call from anyone to talk about their culture and their awareness, even though people are going to them for life-saving operations and for their health care and saving their parents' and grandparents' lives. And yet they don't take the next step of saying, we want you to be a part of our community. The same thing, my good friend Les Heike was up in Wilmer, Minnesota. Les was the mayor there, and they had an immigration, a church had brought in many Somali refugees. And these folks were not doctors and lawyers. They were as poor could be. And that when they came into Wilmer, my good friend Les Heike, as mayor, just opened the doors and said, we're going to be an inclusive community. It wasn't easy. He had a lot of opposition. There was a lot of kind of issues that came around, but they made a commitment, and the stories of that integration into that community has been noted throughout the country. So, but the first step is one that says let's come together and kind of break down the walls, and then also setting a goal and taking affirmative steps, even when there's an incident, even when there's a challenge. Because I will say this: the cities that have had incidents, if you'll note, there's every time you throw out a name or place, unfortunately, there's more and more of these that have happened in the history of it. But the places that have taken and said, listen, we're fixing this. We didn't want it to happen, but we're going to fix it. And when they take the affirmative steps like they've done in hundreds of communities across the country, that's why it is important to become, that if you're not an inclusive city, it's going to be awfully hard to be an amazing city.
Yeah, I love the idea of bringing the different communities together and just opening that channel of communication under the umbrella of the city. I think that step alone, and then having an end goal, where are you ultimately taking to, it's eye-opening for me. It's something that didn't even cross my mind, that that may be something that isn't even going on in some of the more inclusive communities, and the ones that aren't. That's a great opportunity.
Oh, it's the most powerful thing I think I've been associated with, and some of the stories and the people I've met and the stories that I've heard, and how, and this is not about, a lot of times people feel in some cases it's like, well, why should we welcome people? They're coming into our space, if you will. And I can tell you, we could go on, Matt, and we probably will. I'll invite some people on the podcast in the future, some of the people I work with around the country. But you'll see that the benefit comes to the community. It's not something the community is always outgoing and saying, oh, well, now we have to deal with this. Now we have to welcome this new group. We didn't even know they existed. But you'll see in the stories that come out throughout our episodes, it brings so much more quality of life to a community. It brings so much more value. Cities that are inclusive are attracting businesses like you wouldn't believe. And if you don't think it's important, back to our little story about the international, shopping supermarket experiences, communities that understand, hey, we're going to be, having this, we're going to do this. We have a new business coming that's predominantly people from Taiwan or from Korea or something. The communities that say, listen, we want these folks, when they come over, we want them to feel that we have taken note, that we know where they're from, that we know what their culture is and how to do this and that. And it's more than translating your business card to Chinese. It's that's been a kind of a common trend in cities that mayors and so forth that are doing a lot of work with China because of the economic development stuff. Their cards will have on the backside a translation in Chinese, and I've over the years, that's something that I'd say that's a no-brainer. But there's so much more that can be done, and I can tell you the benefits come to the communities when they become amazing and when they become inclusive. It's an amazing event that can really pay dividends.
Well, Jim, I have to tell you, this has been one of my favorite episodes so far. And I'm excited about the follow-ups and bringing on the additional guests, probably some of them you mentioned here and others that you haven't. So if anything else on inclusiveness that we haven't talked about?
I think we've covered it, Matt. Well, we haven't covered it, I can tell you that. But for this episode, and I agree with you, the power that's in this episode is something that any city resident, leader, community activist, that whole gamut of what this podcast is designed to reach. It's not just for mayors and council members. I mean, although I was both of those, but I also have been a community activist. I've also been a business owner. I've also been a chamber member. So those are I still am a chamber member, but those are the type of things that it includes the entire community, and the resources through this podcast and through the guests, like you said, I guarantee you, the people you're going to meet. I hope to have Mayor Perkins on. I hope to have Mayor Doug Eccles from Rock Hill, South Carolina. A good friend of mine from Bellevue, Washington, Conrad Lee. These are people who have lived it. They've seen the power that it happens. Conrad Lee up in Bellevue, Washington, across the street from the City Hall is the Microsoft headquarters. So if you don't think that there's a value into being an inclusive community, it is powerful. So we'll get into some stuff that I think is just going to blow people away. And I'm so happy that podcasting is a way of digging deeper, because quite honestly, most times it's just a 2-minute story on the radio or TV or whatever, and you can't get into the way we've done today.
Yeah, you can actually get some real tangible details and the nuances as well. So Jim, I appreciate it. If you all listening enjoyed this podcast, we always appreciate your reviews, your likes, your shares on social media, and don't forget to subscribe on whatever your favorite podcast app is, so that you don't miss an upcoming episode. There's going to be some more great stuff coming up. And if you'd like to learn more, we have got a special gift for you called 10 Steps to Revitalize Your Downtown. It's a free white paper for those interested in making their town or city amazing. So you can grab your free copy, get instant access to it at amazingcities.org. And again, until next time, here's to making yours an amazing city.
This has been the Amazing Cities Podcast, a production of the Local Government Podcast Network, your choice for local government podcasting. For more information on services of the Local Government Podcast Network, please visit www.localgovpodcasts.com.